Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and you're listening to The Business of Content, the podcast about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize digital content. This week, we're talking about what it takes to run a podcast consulting company. Branded podcasts are on the rise. With 1 out of every 4 Americans saying they listen to at least one podcast a month, companies are increasingly incorporating the medium into their content marketing strategies. And in some cases, these branded podcasts are really taking off with listeners. The first major success of a branded podcast was The Message, a joint venture between the Panoply Network and GE. The science fiction serial has generated over 8 million downloads and, during its run, stayed at the top of the iTunes charts. Gimlet Media, one of the largest and most well-funded podcast networks, recently launched its branded content studio, Gimlet Creative, and it's since created narrative podcasts for Tinder and eBay. Suddenly, there's strong demand for people who can leverage their podcast expertise to help companies launch podcasts that their target consumers will actually want to listen to. One of those people is Ernesto Gluecksmann. Ernesto is the co-founder of Human Factor Media, a podcast consulting company that works with associations to launch and produce podcasts. I recently interviewed Ernesto about how he launched the company and what makes for a successful branded podcast. Okay, let's jump right into it. Hey, Ernesto, thanks for joining me.
Hey, what's going on, Simon? How you doing?
I'm doing great. It's so good to have the tables turned and have you on my podcast
I
instead of vice
know
versa.
it seems kind of strange to me. I think I'm even more nervous now, so I can kind of see it from being the interviewee.
Yeah.
The pressure's on.
So,
I'm used to interviewing people.
So for those that are listening, Ernesto has a podcast called Through the Noise, which interviews communications professionals, and I've been on his podcast twice. Is this your first time on someone else's podcast?
Yeah. Although I guess it's not my first time being interviewed, but yeah, on somebody else's podcast, your podcast,
Mm-hmm.
for sure, right? So,
Yeah.
So this is kind of a new experience for me. But let's go. Let's do it. What do you want to know?
Yeah, so you run a podcast consulting company. What's the name of this consulting company?
We call it Human Factor Media.
Uh-huh.
And
so what does a podcast consulting company do?
So the work we're doing at Human Factor Media, and I guess I should just kind of give a little bit of background. We work a lot with associations. It's kind of our world, but
because you're DC based, and obviously,
that's the clientele here. Yeah. And it's everything from the production, the actual taping experience, to post-production, getting the audio and everything you're doing with like what you do with your show here. And then there's a lot of thinking that goes on to the strategic thing, like with these associations, like why are we doing this? How are we doing this? Who are we bringing on? All of that's kind of bundled into this group called Human Factor Media.
Uh-huh. And so I guess why is there this growing demand? Because you guys are a player in it, but there are lots of bigger players. Like there's Pineapple Media, there's Gimlet Creative that are working with these Fortune 100 brands. Yeah. It seems the first iterations of podcasts were all purely media based, like journalistic and stuff like that. But now brands and of course associations too. Why are they suddenly getting in on the podcasting game?
That's my thinking is on this is that it's actually, at least the way we do the shows for these associations, is that we're sort of it's a reason to have conversations with at least that's how we talk about it with our type of clientele. It's a really kind of intimate form of conversing with folks where maybe these organizations are, they're having conversations with members, but then being able to record it and exposing that conversation to a wider audience has a lot of appeal. Where I think and yeah, you're right. There's a ton of companies that are in this space, and Gimlet, I guess, is like a market leader with their work. I tend to sort of separate out what we do versus kind of their work. Like I think of their stuff as more like, and I don't know, just the way I think of it. Maybe they do a lot of things that I don't know about, but they're more of a narrative storytelling component, and that's really fascinating, entertaining, and they make incredible shows that are super highly produced. Some of those shows take years for them to get it all together. In the space that we're in, we're more interested in capturing ongoing conversations that are happening anyway, and then providing that to a potential wider audience that's looking to be able to kind of, the way I describe it is sort of eavesdrop into conversations that they may not ordinarily be privy to. And so, yeah, in Washington, D.C., there's a ton of associations and nonprofits in general that are having really compelling, really interesting conversations. But we're I guess the only company in the area right now that sort of brings it to them to kind of make sure that they understand why they're doing this and how it can be used to grow the organization and achieve whatever strategic goals they have.
And so like it's like a marketing vehicle for them, you think? Or like what's the? I mean, they have, because they have to shell out money for this. I'm sure you guys aren't inexpensive to hire. So what is what's their ROI?
It's a combination of things. For sure, it can be a marketing, and I know that many podcasts, I would say a great deal of them, are companies or consultants or that use the podcast as a way to connect with people and then market themselves. From an association perspective, that's just one of the reasons you could use the podcasting. Obviously, for an association, growing membership is an important component, but the pressure for some of these groups is that they have to also demonstrate the value of the association. They have a lot of advocacy needs, and sometimes it's just really hard to just reach out to your existing membership through newsletters and social media and getting them to come into an event or webinars. And so we've been trying slowly but surely to bring the concept of the podcast, that you might be able to reach folks that you ordinarily haven't reached. And to me, the most compelling component is kind of what we're doing right now. There's a long form aspect to podcasting. Like when I listen to podcasts, it's like I'm driving somewhere, going to work or whatever, maybe waiting in line or something. Anything where like I need my eyes and hands, they're busy doing other activities, and it's nice to kind of be able to have a background conversation that's like, expanding my knowledge or just developing an understanding of a particular area. So that's why for us, it's really about the conversation. And then the secondary benefits are all the marketing and other things. It's like for us on the way at Human Factor Media, we really focus on making the experience of who, the interviewee and the interviewer, that they have a really good conversation that's recorded. Sometimes with organizations that are pretty button up, right? When you get an executive director to just sit down and not be distracted by anything, and to just kind of talk about his experience at sort of the head of an organization, it can become really compelling content for people that really care about that group or that organization or the company or whatever, because you're kind of getting an opportunity to perhaps listen to somebody share about themselves and the work, the value of the work in a more I don't know. Washington D.C. is there's a lot of hedging of statements and a lot of reviewing newsletters with your attorneys before you make anything. And there's just something compelling about getting a sense of what it's like behind the scenes a little when you get to somebody just talk about what they're doing. And that is what actually drew me to this space. That's what got me into it. I got really excited once I understood that. Yeah, strangely enough, it's kind of like when social media started bubbling up and Twitter excited me with the idea that, I could kind of see or communicate across these sort of siloed institutions. Like I could get a sense of what people are talking about in a particular group if I just followed them. Well, to me, it's kind of the podcast area has grown and evolved and matured to the point where that's kind of if you're doing it right, that's kind of what you're accomplishing as well, just more intimate, right? It's a conversation you're listening to.
But you mentioned that these people are kind of very buttoned up. It's a very kind of DC, where they might not have like natural broadcasting abilities. So you as a consulting company, I guess part of what you do is you have to, it's like talent development and figuring
Oh
out
yeah.
who's going to host. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like how did you go into this staid organization that's never done podcasting before? You know the podcast has to be entertaining. What are you doing to make sure that it's not like this super stilted, buttoned up press release type of podcast?
It's probably one of the hardest components to the whole thing, is to really get them to. There's a lot of steps. Like with anything, with like we call it host development, right? Part of it, because it could be that the executive director is the host, or it could be that somebody, their communications director, or somebody in a leadership role is going to be the interviewer, is going to be kind of the face of the conversation, or the reason some folks will start to follow that conversation. And they like anything, it's like I use like a gym analogy. Like I can't bring somebody on and then if I was a gym coach, I couldn't just say, "Hey, look, we're going to start bench pressing 300 pounds today." You just can't.
Yeah.
You can't just throw them into the mix. So you have to take really careful baby steps at evolving where they are to improving the show. And part of it is, what is it that you're really talking about? So like a little, like sometimes these these groups are super technical and they throw acronyms all over the place that, yes, people in the industry might know what those acronyms are, but the acronyms, without explaining them, then becomes kind of a barrier of entry for people that are listening in. They're like, I don't understand anything these doctors are saying, or I don't understand anything these construction technical certifying and association people are talking about, right? So you have to gently prod them into remember our goal here is to expand the reasons why people would want to join the association. And so you need to think that not everyone understands all these. You're not at that technical, highly technical stage. It doesn't. Every group is different, and that's the complicating factor. It doesn't mean that every association actually cares about reaching a wider audience. They may just care about making sure that they're communicating in a really clear and transparent way for the niche audience that they are approaching. So it always begins with a pilot process, and it begins with sitting down, carefully researching what the organization does and what are the areas that it needs help, and and then that kind of tells us how the mix of the show, how the show direction of the show, where it needs to go. And then, over time, if you're doing it frequently enough, and I think that's sometimes a big mistake with any podcasters, that if you commit to doing this kind of thing for yourself, for your company, for your business, for your organization, that you commit to it like a gym membership. You're not gonna become strong if you don't frequently go to the gym. If you don't frequently do this process, you're not going to evolve and become better at it if you're just sort of going once a month, or once a quarter you're releasing an episode. Like you can tell sometimes with certain groups that they when they don't do this so frequently, they'll do simple mistakes. Like they'll really write down prescriptive questions and the answers, and it's almost like two people are sitting there just reading to each other,
Reading a script to each other.
Yeah, and you're going to pick that up immediately. Like you can just tell.
So you guys will shoot a pilot, or shoot is maybe the wrong word. Record a pilot. It might not ever see the light of day. Like that's like probably like some of these associations. Like, do you say like, hey, you don't even know if you really want to do this? Just hire us to create a pilot for you that you can like shop around to and get buy-in. Like, is that kind of how it works?
Yeah, and I would recommend that for anybody starting any podcast idea, is to create a pilot process, because going through the process that you think is gonna be involved, especially if you're totally new to podcasting. There's like a lot of detail that has to be worked out, and I think a really big mistake is people get really excited about doing a podcast, and then they'll record an episode and then immediately register on iTunes and then release that episode. It could be fine. It could work out just fine that way. But I think doing a series of them beforehand, and then the way we kind of work with some of these groups is, do we have a show here is what we're trying to answer. And with that, sometimes I send those shows to specific people, stakeholders, maybe with the association, they'll send them to board members, they'll send them to certain types of members and say, hey, have a listen to this and let me know if you think that this is something we should do, and let me know if this is something you'd like to participate. And then that helps you get a better sense of, that there could be some energy behind this to do it. Part of it is also just we kind of learn through just trial and error with organizations, button up organizations that really want to make sure before they invest all this money into doing this in time and energy that their members are going to listen to it. A lot. Look, we have to understand. I think Edison's research last year's was 1 in 4 Americans are active podcast listeners. Well, that means that 3 in 4 of them are not. And so if any given group or any given niche or area, getting buy-in from other people that don't quite understand what podcasting is about or how compelling it is, it's really nice to be able to just send them a link and say, hey, just listen to this for a couple of minutes and tell me what your thoughts are,
So you're saying I was wrong to release my first episode already of my podcast?
Well, I don't know, Simon. You do a lot of content development. I think you're just fine. I think you just keep releasing them. I think it's perfect the way you're doing it, in the sense that you're just coupling it on to what you're already doing.
Yeah.
But hey, listen, if you had done like 5, I would have released the first 5 in a batch, just in case somebody suddenly discovers that Simon's podcast is up and I want to binge listen, right?
Yeah.
So if otherwise you're gonna have to wait until Simon cuts out another episode, and if there's only 1 or 2 in there, it's like where's. By the way, that speaks to consistency. That's another big one. I think people should think about that. When I discover a really interesting and compelling podcast, there's nothing more kind of disappointing to know that there's only like 10 episodes and then that's the end of it. Or if I see I've discovered the podcast, there's a lot of episodes, I see that it's released on a weekly basis or something, then that becomes one that I'm definitely subscribing to, because I'll get to it, and then I'll definitely binge listen through many episodes in a pace, right?
Yeah. And I also read that if you want your podcast featured on iTunes, I mean, obviously only a small percentage do, but you have a higher chance if you have several episodes at once.
Yeah, the new and noteworthy category, that was super helpful to when we started releasing some of these episodes. Yeah, like Apple's looking for and I think they could do a better.
They don't want to feature something where there's like, this guy might only upload this one episode, so we're not going to give our tremendous marketing power to throw it behind this if they don't show any signs of consistency.
Exactly. It'd be, but I go back to they could improve this by there's a lot Apple could do to better improve. I really do think if you're a show that is putting out episode after episode in a consistent manner, you should be. That's a thoughtful, highly, there's a lot of production value that's going into it, and so you should be rewarded over the shows that maybe release once a year or once a quarter. Although there are super popular shows like what's that guy, that hardcore history guy that takes forever to research an area, and then he releases a series. So there is that aspect of it, right, that you'd have to account for. But
so tell me about a client that you're really proud of, like how you developed a show kind of from start to finish.
Let me see. They're all kind of like my babies in some way, or at least probably like my one of my partners and thinks of them that way too.
Or the most successful show thus far in terms of like reach and mind share?
Well, I think one of the most surprisingly successful ones for us has been a little group called the Footwear Distributors and Retailers of America. It's a small trade association that represents basically all the footwear makers. And something that I learned when I first started with those guys that I didn't know is that something like 95% of all shoes we buy and have are made overseas. So basically what that means is that they have to deal, as a group, they have to deal a lot with tariffs and logistics and customs and distribution and supply chains, and a really complicated world that they're involved in getting us like the latest sneakers in stores. In any case, if you're not in that world, if you're not a footwear manufacturer, it's probably not going to interest you as a show. But the fact that this association, and this, you have to picture, this is like a really small association. There's like 4 or 5 staff members, and they have an office here in Washington, D.C., a really small office right next to the White House, and they are constantly trying to advocate for their group. And so if you were to pop into their show, it's called the Shoe-In Show, you can see that they are having a lot of fun on that show. And they are also very serious about getting business done for their members. And I think the executive director, Matt Priest, had once commented to me that, part of the reason for doing the show is that they get some sponsors to help with the production costs. But he had said the impact of the show has been so significant for their events. They've had more people at their events. They had people recognize them at their events. They've for gaining access. I think they had done a quick interview with at the time with the Obama administration with Ambassador Fromm at the White House. All of that has been so significant for them that they could never see dropping the podcast component of all their work that they're doing. It's so much of what they do on that show helps highlight the work that they do behind the scenes. And because they also have so much fun, that the members are really feeling connected. People in the industry, their industry, are feeling really connected to these characters, these 4 folks. And so when you look at that and you pull that all together, they are, for a good long while, they were the most popular show we've had on our list right from the jump. And that was amazing to me because I also work with other groups that are 10 times larger than they are, with vastly more available resources, and they just weren't quite getting there because, well, it's like the gym. Everybody comes in at different levels of ability, and it just takes time to evolve. But yeah, I think the Shoe-In Show is a great example of, and by the way, they're entertaining to listen to, even if you know nothing about the shoe industry. And that's, by the way, that's one of our markers.
Or if you're just someone who's just interested in fashion, or so, like they would probably appeal to people who are into the industry, or like it's a trade industry, but at the same time, it's also a trade industry that affects like a lot of people who are hardcore into fashion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things is, one of the compelling characteristics that we sort of track for us is, if let's say you're driving in your car and you're with your spouse, you're in the shoe industry, but your spouse doesn't care anything about shoes. If you put the show on and it kind of grabs that person's attention and goes, I didn't know 95% of the shoes are all. If it's compelling enough in that way, then you got the right mix. You're engaging. You're able to draw people into it, and that, that's hard. That's hard to do. And I think the Shoe-In Show is a great example of that.
Yeah, it's interesting you say like how they find sponsors. I was listening to I don't listen to a lot of branded podcasts, but Gimlet Media did a partnership with Tinder called like DTR or something like that. It's like a really good podcast, and they have sponsors. So I'm listening to branded sponsored like commercials on a branded podcast. But it's interesting because like if you're becoming like a media outlet, which these podcasts, that you're doing, like you can actually, like the podcast can pay for itself in some ways, the production cost, by finding sponsors for it, even though it in and of itself is a branded podcast in a lot of
Yeah,
ways.
it gets kind of squirrely. It gets kind of like, because and that's another thing about this is like some especially nonprofits that get involved with this stuff. One of the driving needs of a nonprofit is to get media, attention, is to be seen by audiences. And if they start doing the podcast and they're doing it right, guess what? You suddenly have become your own media outlet. And I think that's the big that's a big opportunity to consider, that you don't have to go through necessarily a filtered media outlet that has their own agenda. You can create your outlet and over time draw people to listen to your story, right, in your way, in the way that you want to share. And so for sure there's a lot of organizations that think like, hey, the media is not really covering us in the way we want to be seen or heard or understood. And by the way, everyone knows when you're listening to a trade association's podcast, guess what? Yeah, you're listening to their perspective, and you can say an outsider could say, well, that's kind of biased, but yeah, I get it, yes, but you got to understand this is their perspective. If you can at least appreciate the complexity from where they're coming from and what they're having to deal with, both things. I mean, then that's accomplishing a lot, in my opinion. And I think that's another compelling aspect of why I got into doing this. As part of it, was I just wanted to hear podcasts from organizations that have an interesting perspective, but I didn't want to go through all their press releases and read stuff on their website. I just wanted to hear some of their leaders talk about what it is that they do. So why not do it on a podcast, right?
Mm-hmm. So I guess my last question is the why. Obviously I'm able to do this podcast. It's just me during my free time, using relatively inexpensive tools. What's the value proposition of an actual hiring an outside consulting company?
Yeah, you know what? That's a good question. It just depends on a lot of factors. Part of it is we have a model and a structure, so things can, we don't get surprised too often. If we start with a group and they want to start doing their show, and then suddenly they're approached by, hey, a potential sponsor. Well, we're structured and set up in a way that I can actually get that sponsorship into the episodes, into all their backlog episodes, because I thought through that aspect of it with our team. Like there's like things that we know are likely to happen. And so yeah, you pay and for us, we actually have studios. We have like a quiet space. Sometimes
you have an actual professional recording studio in Northern Virginia.
Yeah.
Right.
So
and you have Blake who records musicians for a living. So I'm guessing, we're using like software right now, but I'm guessing in terms of sound, I don't know all the technical terms, but in sound design, stuff like that, he's definitely a level above what I could ever do. Right.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. He does a lot of he makes everybody's voices sound a little richer, which is good because everybody has a feeling of like their voice is not good enough for the show or what. I mean, it's like I tell people, this stuff, you can do it yourself. Simon, you're doing it, right? It's fine. But folks that come to us are paying us so that they don't have to worry about having to figure it out, how to do it themselves, how to do it at a professional level that is expected for when you're doing something that represents an organization, and also being ready for any incidental. So like a lot of things for us is like the minute we start doing podcasts for an association, they're going to tell us they want to do a live taping at their expo or at their event. And so then that brings in a whole lot of extra complexity. Namely, you better have backups to backups of things. Because like once you're going live tapings, you want to make sure that you have equipment that is ready to go if there's a mic fails or something. You just have to have a professional involved with all that. And so yeah, you gotta pay for that level of expertise and being prepared. And then all the Blake's been in the sound design and in showbiz for decades now. So you're getting a creative director also as part of your ad tech that's helping develop the quality of the show. And then again, it goes back to the whole gym analogy.
And a lot of these associations have like really small staffs, even if they have big memberships, like full-time staff. So like they just don't have time to like learn the ins. Even like I kind of maybe it's probably a little bit easier for me since I work in content full time. So I could like take, the 8 hours it took to research this and I have the free time to like schedule interviews and do all that kind of stuff. But a lot of these like are pretty small staffs, right? So they need somebody to really just hold their hand through the whole thing.
Yeah, with competing priorities, right? They have a bunch of other things they're supposed to be doing for their group. That definitely speaks to the nonprofit sector as a whole. Like a lot of nonprofits are just busy actually doing the work of the nonprofit, and then they're like don't really have the time to think through all these particulars, and that's what you pay a professional group like us to do it. But that doesn't mean anybody that anybody shouldn't be dissuaded that you need to pay for a group like us. On the contrary, I think for sole practitioners, small business owners, look, man, this is the tools are out there that make it really easy and compelling to just get started. The hard part will be to think about what's the best possible type of conversation you can have and who to have it with, right? And coordinating all that.
Okay, well, those were all the questions I had. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today. Ernesto, where can people find you?
Humanfactormedia.com is the easiest way if you're curious, especially if you're an association, you're looking at podcasting. We'd love to talk to you. It could be anybody, to tell you the truth, but humanfactormedia.com is the best thing. And Simon, I really appreciate you coming on my show. Obviously want to have you back as you develop like this sort of independent journalism. I think what you're doing is really the future here. If when I start, I'm going to subscribe to the show and I want to listen to Simon Owen's story going through this world. And I think that there's a lot of compelling content you're creating. So I'm excited to be on it. I'm excited to be one of the people on it. So thank you.
Everybody make sure to check out Through the Noise, which is Ernesto's podcast about the communications industry.
I appreciate
all right, Ernesto, thanks so much. And let's have you on again sometime soon.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. That's all I have for you this week. If you like the business of content, subscribe to it on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. See you next week.